Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the session on the National Climate Assessment. My name is Emily Cloyd, and my colleague Fred Lipschultz is the other organizer for the session. I'm going to give you a few brief introductory remarks, and then we will start on the talks. So the National Climate Assessment is required by law by the Global Change Research Act, which calls for an assessment every 4 years that integrates, evaluates, and interprets the findings of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, analyzes the effects of global change on a number of sectors, and analyzes current trends in global change, current and for the next 25 to 100 years. For the third National Climate Assessment Report, you can see the outline there on the screen. We have, in addition to the sectors required by law, looked at a number of intersections between those sectors. We also look at climate change by region and by biogeographical crosscuts. And then new for this report, we're looking at the responses to climate change, so chapters on decision support, mitigation, and adaptation. The report also talks about an agenda for climate change science into the future and the sustained assessment process and how we carry forward the assessment into the future. So there are the sectors that I just outlined. You'll see them there. And then, as I said, intersections between those sectors, things like water, energy, land, urban, tribes, land use, rural communities, and biogeochemical cycles. These are all new for this third assessment process. And then we have 8 regions for the country, plus chapters on coasts and on oceans. To date, the process has been we have an interagency working group for the U.S. Global Change Research Program that involves 13 plus federal agencies that plans and manages the federal components of the assessment, and that put on a series of workshops that looked at methodologies, model scenarios, and approaches for assessment. We also have a 60-member federal advisory committee that is responsible for developing the 2013 report and providing advice on the sustained process. That federal advisory committee was responsible for the selection of the 240 authors from academic, public, and private sectors that are writing the report. So for each of the regions, we had new regional climate histories and projections. There was also development of an indicator system, which will be deployed in the next coming years that will look at the effects of global change and adaptation and responses. The report will be coming out as an ebook format rather than a paper format, as well as a printed summary document, and that will take place in early 2014. It will also front a global change information system, which is the electronic repository for all of the information behind the assessment. And all of this provides a foundation for strong communications products that will be useful for a variety of audiences. There is a public comment period coming up on the draft report, which will open January 14. It will also be a period for the National Research Council to review it. There will be an online comment system. And since the report is not yet public, it won't be until January 14. Just to note that the authors presenting today will be talking about major findings from technical input reports, literature reviews, and processes that inform the draft chapters, not the findings of the chapters themselves. So just before I end, one mention that this session is being videotaped. So just so you all know, it is part of the video on demand system. And with that, I will introduce our first talk, which will come from Susie Moser and Julie Maldonado.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Whoa, this is bright. I can, yes, barely read my own notes here. So I'm going to speak to you here in my role as a member of this NACADAC, the Federal Advisory Team. Thank you. And as a member of the Executive Secretariat and as a co-chair of the Engagement and Communication Working Group for the Federal Advisory Committee. We're going to do a team tag thing. And I'm going to repeat some of the things that you just heard, but just because that went so fast, you'll probably be happy to hear it again. Why are we doing this? Well, it comes from the 1990 Global Change Research Act, and the mandate here is to provide for development and coordination of a comprehensive research program which assists the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural global change. And every 4 years, every 4 years, as you heard, we're supposed to produce these national synthesis reports. Well, that hasn't happened. We're right now on number 3, and if you do the math, 22 years divided by 4 is not 3 reports. So we haven't achieved that. And so therefore, this assessment actually stands on a whole different basis than the previous ones, which were really these report writing exercises. Once it was accomplished, everyone went home, and then it was a massive act of remobilizing people for the next assessment. So we're not doing that. We're trying to build a sustained assessment process. And so that's the first goal of this, to put this entire assessment synthesizing process on a much more committed, long-term, ongoing basis. The second one is that we actually are working with decision makers to figure out what climate change information do they want. And so in scenario workshops, we have tried to figure out what kind of information they want. Another important innovation in this assessment is that we're not just focusing on impacts, but as you just heard in the outline, we're actually also looking at what is the country doing in terms of adaptation and mitigation. How far are we along? Are we prepared enough to deal with the threat as the science tells us is coming? And then the last thing is, and that is a really important part of the sustained assessment process, is that we actually build the capacity of the nation to do assessments over time. And so there are regional and sectoral hubs to build up this capacity. A couple of the intended outcomes. So in addition to these quadrennial synthesis reports, we want to produce products, reports, shorter reports that are much more focused on things that people feel are of greatest interest at any one time. There will be all the data that went into writing this report and any report going forward will be available on this global change information system. I'll come back to that in a minute. We will actually try to learn from our own mistakes and see how well we're doing, how well this sustained assessment is going, and build that into our process going forward in actually moving towards reduced risk, vulnerability, and impacts. And then we're also building up this national indicator system, because from so many stakeholders we hear, they don't want to just have a huge long report. They want to be able to sort of, on the similar to what's the Dow Jones for today, they want to look at indicators and see how well are we doing in certain sectors, in certain areas. And so that is a huge piece. We're just in the beginning stages of that, but that will go on as we move forward. This is a follow-up slide to the idea of having a global change information system that is really the one-stop shop in many ways for scientific findings on global change. All the technical inputs will be available there. All the data, models, scenarios that went into writing this report and future ones, case studies of impacts and responses, these indicators I mentioned, and then ways to actually visualize that information. Let me say a little bit more about the sustained assessment. So one of the important things that the law already asks us to is that we focus on a handful of sectors, but for each one of these synthesis reports, we might get 8 to 10 pages or something of text space in the final document to say something about what's going on in the nation. That often is not enough to meet the decision maker needs. And so to have the opportunity to deepen into sectoral or regional or cross-cutting issues, we will have reports in between the major synthesis reports. We will make space for new scientific issues of concern that simply can't be captured in the depth they deserve in one of those quadrennial reports. It is very much about building the human capital, the capacity across the nation to conduct these assessments. It's one thing to have the capacity to do science. It's a whole other capacity to be able to synthesize across a wide range of relevant data and information into an assessment chapter or synthesis. We want to be able to respond better to what decision makers need in terms of reducing risks and increasing their opportunities. And to make sure that there is full review, full transparency at all stages of this process. So these are just a few of the elements of a sustained assessment, but I can't emphasize enough the third bullet about how it is about building the network and the capacity among contributors to this. A couple of the things that we want to do in terms of these individual in-between reports, there are what we call the foundational topics, doing scenarios or the indicators, evaluation, how do you value impacts, or to make sure that we just don't get stuck on dollar signs only. What are adequate methods to do that? Scenario development, and so on and so forth. Those are foundational. We want to do this on a continual basis so that next time when we do the next report in 2017, we're not going to start all over again and get delayed. So this information will be an ongoing activity of the assessment. And then the special topics, I just mentioned a few here: food security. What's the international context? I mean, the U.S., even though we think that often, but we're actually not that isolated. And we are connected to what's happening in other parts of the world in terms of impacts or responses, and we need to take that into account. It will modify how we think about what is happening and what we're doing here. So just a couple of examples, and then I'll end with this and hand it over to Julie here, which is that this assessment has a very, very strong focus on communication and engagement. We have a working group that has been very active. We have a strategic plan of how to develop and engage the public, stakeholders. The working group I mentioned is very active, meets regularly. It's sort of, if you will, the strategic arm of coming up with ideas of what we can do. All of us have day jobs, and then we have Emily here as the one and only paid staff to actually implement those things. But we also have something you're going to hear about in a minute, which is a large network of organizations that are helping us to implement that. And so I'll let Julie speak to that in a minute. What we try to do is not just have a newsletter and a website and then go home. That is just a one-way form of very passive communication that we feel is insufficient. People actually do not know that there was a second assessment in 2009. Most people still don't know about that particular assessment. So it's not enough to just have these static one-way forms of communication. So we have a whole range of things. I want to highlight climate conversations. Again, you're going to hear about that more. It was an effort to bring people who are not yet in the climate conversation to the table, engage them on climate change, ask what their concerns are, and see how we can bring their concerns into the assessment process. And it generated a lot of really great ideas about in one of these focused assessment products that we might think about in the future. So it's just one of the many ways in which we engage people, and I encourage you all to be engaged and be part of it. And here I turn it to Julie to hear more about what we're doing.
Continuing off from what Susie was discussing, one of the ways we have engaged has also been through our request for information, and through this we actually request information where folks from across the board, from government agencies to academia to nonprofits to NGOs to local communities themselves, submitted over 250 technical inputs to provide information into this process. There's actually, in total, about 500 of these inputs. Some of them were organized by the teams themselves, but there were 250 individual ones submitted. And this is just an example of the broad spectrum. I organized this with 4 tribal communities in coastal Louisiana, which this input provided key information that has run through several chapters of the of informing some of the information for different chapters throughout the assessment. And so these inputs have been used and received well throughout the whole duration of the process. And as you can see also, Susie mentioned, we have had a lot of engagement on the ground. There's been 14 process workshops, 7 listening sessions and town hall meetings at conferences such as these. We've had over 20 organized sessions and invited talks. There's been 9 NCA Development Advisory Committee meetings held throughout the process. We've had over 12 regional team workshops and meetings and over 20 sectoral team meetings and workshops. And also, as we start to roll out the draft and receive input from folks, we're going to be having upcoming town hall meetings across different regions throughout the country. And as Susie also mentioned, we have had, some of our highlights have been climate conversations. We've had 4 of these in different parts of the country. They've been hosted by the Keystone Center, and we typically get about 40, 50 participants at these conversations. And the goal is really to bring in new voices into a conversation about the impacts of weather and climate within the U.S. We've also hosted a number of listening sessions where these have been held at a variety of professional society meetings and conferences with the goal of introducing the NCA to new audiences, continuing to keep audiences who have already been engaged in the process, and also asking for feedback and comments from the audience to feedback into the report itself. Specific to engagement and communication, in terms of those technical inputs I was discussing a minute ago, 13 of these have actually been specific to engagement and communication topics. And we've received these from professional societies, interagency working groups, regional technical input teams, and NGOs and the academic community. And the inputs and offers of capacity included within these inputs have also been offers to report on research findings and case studies, developing materials for specific projects going on, and joining the long-term network of networks, which Susie mentioned, has been off the ground for some time now. It's known as the NCA Net, and this consists of about 60 organizations so far with, there's always been a continuous stream of new folks joining the process. And it's really a network of organizations to go beyond the NCA and go beyond just the federal government itself and engage a variety of new communities throughout the country. And the goal is we really want to build a long-term capacity to conduct and use assessments and cultivate partnerships with organizations for continuing to build upon that sustained assessment process. We also have a website, as you can see, which you can visit you'll see a list of our partner organizations. We hold monthly conversations with our partners. There's we use really an affinity group model for conducting the work. Some of the affinity groups include Built Environment, Informed Decision Making, Communication Group. They also serve as a liaison to the NCA Development Advisory Committee Working Group on Engagement and Communication. And on the website, you can also see a list of the activities, and these often include events held by the NCA in support of the NCA, directly related to some of the NCA topics. Right now, we have several folks representing organizations from the NCA Net contributing to articles and pieces going on in a variety of publications that directly align with many of the NCA topics. And for our ongoing and continued engagement work, we've been working on for some time now a social networking analysis to support tracking of engagement with stakeholders and how this information moves through a social network and gets out to new communities that we're working with and building on what we've done thus far. We have work on meaningful engagement opportunities during the NCA Development Advisory Committee meetings. We're also going to be doing a speakers bureau, short video talks, creating engagement resource and idea bank, eliciting review comments on the draft report by going to various town hall meetings, professional society meetings in different parts of the country and with representing different communities. And we have a plan for releasing a development outreach engagement plan for the release of the draft report. And of course, along with all this also comes some challenges. As Susie mentioned, we do have limited staff capacity, and the working group members all do have other jobs and tasks that they have to fill their days. We have long-term timeframes for report development, so it is challenging to kind of keep people's interest and meaningful engagement through the process. Is also a key goal to kind of reach out to new communities and find the right ways to do that, which also provides challenges in itself of who are those people, what are those organizations, to really get out and define yourself in a new community. And also how to frame issues in ways that are interesting to a variety of communities. And like Emily had mentioned, the draft report will be coming out January 14, and we would you guys really need to provide comments on the report if you want to see your information get in there. And the way to do that is you do go online and submit any comments you have that way. And we also are going to have a 2-pager for information will be posted somewhere.
In the back.
In the back. So please take those as you exit after the session. And just so you can see, these are all the folks who have been heavily engaged with getting the engagement plan and process off the ground and running. Thank you. Do we have time? We have like a minute. Oh. Are there any questions?
Very good question. We try to deal with that all the time. It's a big challenge, given that, on the one hand, we try to synthesize the mandate for this is to synthesize and submit that actually to Congress. So that's our primary and first audience. But, of course, the decision makers are everywhere. It's folks in regions, in businesses, at local, state levels, whatever. So it's very, very difficult to do that all with one report, and we don't claim to do that. There's no way that can be done. So you might want to think about it sort of as a layer cake where you can get to the data behind it to drill down in the more synthesized, focused products that we want to produce. There will be ways in which we can get down to regions. You will hear later in this particular session still about scenarios that are specifically developed for regions. We're obviously trying to partner with people in regions and in particular sectors and have stakeholders involved in the writing of those particular reports, so that, basically, if we were to point, say, someone from the Western United States to a piece within our report, we can summarize at this high level that might be interesting to someone in Washington or, at a sort of broad regional level, and then we point them to the people who actually produce the information underneath it at that scale that is much more relevant to them. So it's really more like a layered approach to it, and this technical system that we have where all the data, everything will be available, is the way you ultimately get access to it. So it's impossible to do that in one document only. It's more the layer cake underneath it that does that job. But working along the way with stakeholders is a really critical part to even know what is it that they want. And so one of the groups of partners that we have are the RISAs that exist around the country, Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Reports. You're going to hear from Greg Garfin, who leads up one of those assessments, so you get a better sense from that how it works at the regional level. I can't see if there's anyone else with a raised hand. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So the next talk is The Science of Climate Change by John Walsh, representing a team that pulled together a large chapter that summarized all of the current climate science knowledge that we're putting into the report.
So you've got the mouse? Okay. Okay. And the left is forward? Left is forward. Okay, the climate science chapter comes early in the NCA report. Its purpose is to synthesize information on our changing climate and to assess what's known and what is not known about the big picture of climate change in the U.S. The chapter has 9 authors. They're listed on the first slide there. That group's been working together for about a year on this chapter. The main elements of the chapter are assessments of the underlying drivers of climate change. That includes external forcing and variability. And secondly, the manifestations of changes in climate in the U.S. and the surrounding areas. And the changes include historical, changes that have been observed, and ones that are projected. And I should mention that the following presentation, which will be given by Laura Stevens with Ken Kunkel, goes hand in hand with this one. Laura's talk will emphasize the regional changes and the spatial patterns of the temperature and precipitation changes. In this presentation, I'll emphasize the manifestations of changes in temperature and precipitation, meaning some of the impact variables. And as we say there in red, we will not be presenting key findings, but we will be highlighting information that is being considered as we develop the key findings. And the reason for that, as Emily said, is the chapter is still in draft form together with the rest of the assessment, and it's undergoing review and revision. This slide shows the range of the climate variables that we considered in our chapter. And the main point here is there's a lot more to the climate change topic, the climate science topic, than temperature and precipitation. In this particular diagram, the arrows show the recent changes that have been documented in the published literature. So one of our challenges has been to try to bring together this various the diverse types of information that have already appeared in the literature on those different variables. Now, globally and nationally, there's variability that has to be reckoned with in any type of climate assessment. And this variability is interannual, which we show on the left diagram here, which is a time series of the global temperatures. There's also variability on decadal and multi-decadal timescales. We show that on the right with the recent history of U.S. averaged temperature. So this variability has to be assessed when it comes to evaluating and interpreting trends over different time periods. And we've spent a lot of time trying to place variability into the context of external forcing. There was just a recent paper by Clara Desser and her group, which points out that variability is not going to go away in the future either. So it will continue to be one of the big challenges in this type of assessment. But in spite of the variability, you'll notice there that the last few decades have been the warmest in the periods of record, both globally and in the U.S. For future projections, the assessment relies mainly on the SRES scenarios. That's the previous generation of climate scenarios used in the IPCC activity. The reliance on the SRES scenarios is due mainly to the timing of the release of the newer scenarios. The newer scenarios are the RCP scenarios. Now, these newer scenarios span a wider range of possible futures. And that wider range of scenarios is the reason why the projected global temperatures, which we show in this diagram, have a wider range. The newer scenarios, the RCP ones, are the ones in solid lines. The older SRES scenarios are the ones in the dashed lines. And I should point out that there is one low curve here in the RCP series of scenarios. This is a scenario that would require a 70% reduction of human-related emissions by 2050. So that's an extreme reduction. That means we need to, there need to be a pretty dramatic change of course, but we do include this scenario in our chapter because it shows what could be achieved by some fairly dramatic mitigation on our part. As an example of the impact variables that we've looked at in this chapter, we have a summary here of changes in the frost-free season length. This was put together by the group, our author team, Ken Kunkel's group at NCDC. The frost-free season length has increased by anywhere from about a week up to as much as 3 weeks as you move around the U.S. This is over the last couple decades relative to the first 60 years of the 20th century. According to climate models, that frost-free season length is projected to increase even further. And we'll be following the format of the previous assessment in showing some of these projected changes by showing high-emission scenario projections and low-emission scenario projections. Because in the case of almost every variable we're looking at, there are major differences between the scenarios. We've looked at heavy precipitation events as well. This is an example showing how changes in the precipitation, the percentage of precipitation falling in the heaviest events have varied over the last 60 years or so. These numbers are the percentage increases in the amount of precipitation that falls in the heaviest 1% of the events. And you can see how the sign of the change is the same across the country. The largest increases are in the Midwest and the Northeast. And that increase in heavy precipitation events is consistent with observed changes in annual flood magnitudes. This is a published result from Hirsch and Ryberg about a year ago, in which the green triangles represent increases in annual flood magnitude based on streamflow measurements. The browns represent decreases. Now, one of the topics we've wrestled with in this chapter is drought. It's one of the major challenges to assess. This figure shows a time series of the Palmer Drought Severity Index from 1900 to 2100, averaged over the U.S. It's actually showing the percentage of the area of U.S. and Mexico together that's in extreme drought, based on observationally driven reconstructions and then the output from model simulations as drivers of the drought computation. This was published about a year ago by Michael Wiener, one of our authors. And this is a fairly striking figure in the sense that the drought severity increases through the next century to the point where by late in the century, the fraction of the U.S. and Mexico in extreme drought is comparable to what we had back during the Dust Bowl period. Now, the catch is that this figure is based on the Palmer Drought Index, which is very sensitive to temperature. In fact, it's more sensitive to temperature than most other drought indices. A recent paper that came out just a couple of weeks ago by Tom Carl shows that according to the historical data, there's no significant trend in the proportion of the U.S. that's been affected by severe and extreme drought. So we've essentially had to reconcile this type of finding with this type of output from climate models. And our distillation of the various results will be in one of the key findings in the chapter. In fact, I think Laura Stevens will show the precipitation changes that go with these time frames over the U.S. And in our chapter, we also we will be looking at changes in soil moisture as an alternative to that Palmer Index. Another topic that we've wrestled with is hurricanes. This is an active research area. And here's an example of why generalizations on the hurricane topic are difficult. This figure shows the observed trends in a hurricane intensity index, the power dissipation index, from a published paper a few years ago with our updates. The trend is upward in the North Atlantic, but downwards in the eastern North Pacific, which means an increase in overall hurricane intensity in hurricane activity in the North Atlantic, but not in the eastern Pacific. There's been published work on how hurricane intensity might be expected to change in the future. This is an example from a paper that came out 2 years ago, showing the projected changes in Atlantic hurricanes in various intensity categories. Bottom line here is a projected increase in the more severe hurricanes, categories 4 and 5, decreases in the weaker hurricane intensity categories, at least decreased frequencies. There's a caveat here as well that we've had to wrestle with. The underlying processes here that link warming oceans to hurricane intensity are complicated. The way the atmosphere responds depends on the type of ocean temperature increase, whether it's localized and regional or whether it's a more uniform global increase. So the picture isn't as clear as it might appear at first glance. We also will talk in this chapter about other types of storms, extratropical cyclones, heavy snow events, convective storms. We'll point out that to a large extent, we're not able at this point to relate climate drivers to changes in some types of these storms. When that's the case, we'll say so in the chapter. We've wrestled with sea level. In fact, there's been input to our sea level section from a lot of sources. I'm not going to give the key finding here, but I will just show one example of an historical sea level record that we've considered. This is a reconstruction of sea level off the Atlantic coast in pink. The global sea level from tide gauge data is on the right, and the main point here is that in the literature, there's documented evidence that the recent rate of sea level rise is greater than it's been at any time in the last 2,000 years. If you extrapolate this rise through the rest of this century, you get a rise of something like 11 inches by the end of the century. It's one lower bound. The upper bound is the more challenging one to wrestle with, and that'll be in the report when it comes out for review in January. And the last topic I'll mention is the cryosphere, snow and ice variables. This is a result we considered from a recent paper by Jiao Wang and the Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab group, showing the trend over time in Great Lakes ice cover. And the bottom line here from this study is something like a 63% decrease in Great Lakes ice cover since the early 1970s, so over the last 40 years. There are pictures down at the bottom showing Lake Superior during a fairly typical year, at least climatologically for that period, and during a recent year. So there's certainly some interesting variability and apparent change in Great Lakes ice cover. Arctic sea ice has also been in the news a lot. It's in our assessment chapter. These figures are from the National Snow and Ice Data Center, showing the ice cover last September, just 3 months ago, compared to the late 20th century median ice extent in orange. The time series of the September ice extent is shown on the right. You can see how we had a new record this past year, and numerically we're down 40 or 50% from the late 1970s in the amount of ice that survives the summer melt in the Arctic Ocean. There's some caveats here as well that we need to wrestle with. If you look at the Bering Sea in the wintertime, there's no decline in winter ice extent. These figures at the top are for the summer. If you look at the southern hemisphere, there's no decline in sea ice cover. So the picture is not globally uniform when it comes to the sea ice. Here's the last figure, the projections of sea ice change. This is from a recent paper by Julian Strove, looking at, in this case, the sea ice projections based on those newer RCP scenarios. These are the ones that go with the CMIP-5 models. And there are sort of model averages given by the solid lines, ranges given by the colored bars. All the scenarios show decreases of ice cover. You'll notice that there's only one scenario here, this RCP 2.6 scenario, that levels the ice cover off, stabilizes it at a level comparable to where we are now. And we should point out also, one of the main points of this published study is that the actual retreat tends to be faster than what the models are projecting under any scenario. But with respect to that stabilization scenario, again, we should repeat that that's a scenario where we need to reduce emissions by 70% by 2050, mid-century. So here's the summary of what will be in this chapter of the upcoming assessment. The chapter will span multiple climate elements, some I've tried to highlight here. It will discuss the attribution of the changes, including the role of natural and internal variability, natural variability referring to the solar and volcanic forcing. It will span the entire U.S., provides and hopefully provide context for the regional chapters, and it will provide a range of projections for future changes, and that will include comparisons of these CMIP-3 and CMIP-5 simulations, which are based on the two different sets of forcing scenarios. So the chapter will be available for review next month for public comment. We welcome your feedback. I'll stop there and say thanks.
Okay. Time for one question for John.
There's one over here on the right.
Yeah. I was under the impression that the Palmer index for droughts was only effective for very short term, like annual or monthly, and that if you use it for climate model projection, it doesn't take into account water vapor and use it very specifically.
Yeah, there's actually a paper that just came out on that, there's a paper that just came out on that topic of the Palmer Drought Index and how evapotranspiration is computed. And I think what they showed was that if you use a different measure of evapotranspiration, the Palmer Index does show much weaker trends over time than the actual Palmer Drought Severity Index that has been used here. So that validity of the Palmer Drought Index is one of the key issues we need to look at when it comes to drought changes.
The next talk will be by Laura Stevens, and it'll follow on from John's talk, giving the regional trends and scenarios that were used in the assessment chapters for the 8 regions of the U.S. Laura?
Good afternoon. So I'm going to talk about the regional climate trends and scenarios for the United States. This is input to the National Climate Assessment, which may or may not be used by the chapter authors themselves. And as Emily stated earlier, these are not draft findings of the report itself. So the outline of my talk, I'll go over what the climate trends and scenarios documents are that we're currently producing. We'll look at a few regional trends in temperature and precipitation. So I'll describe what the regional outlook scenarios are that we used, and then we'll go over a few model simulated temperature and precipitation changes. So the climate trends and scenarios documents include 35 authors. There are 9 documents, one for each of the National Climate Assessment regions and one for the contiguous United States. And each document is in 2 sections. The first half includes climate factors and climate trends for each region, and the second half looks at climate outlooks using general circulation models for 2 of the IPCC emission scenarios. These climate documents contain almost 700 pages in total and almost 600 figures. I'm going to try and give you a very small snapshot in 12 minutes. So here are the NCA regions. You saw this map earlier. We have the 8 regions of the United States and then the contiguous United States. So let's jump into seasonal trends in temperature. This is an example of one of the figures in the first half of each document. This one is for the contiguous United States, and this shows seasonal temperature anomalies relative to the period of 1901 to 1960. And as you can see, for each season, there's a statistically significant increase in temperatures for each season and also for the annual. This map shows the change in observed temperatures for the United States, and this is for the last 20 years relative to the reference period of 1901 to 1960. And you can see here that temperatures have increased almost everywhere throughout the United States, with the exception of the southeast. This lack of observed 20th century warming is what we refer to as the warming hole. And you can also see this effect in summer temperatures for the Midwest and Great Plains also. The bar graphs show decadal temperature changes relative to the reference period of 1901 to 1960. And you can see that the most recent decade of the 2000s has seen the greatest increase in temperatures for every single region of the United States. We also look at some extremes metrics. This is an index of heat waves, and this shows that the relative number of heat waves was highest in the 1930s during the Dust Bowl era. But we can also see, if you look at the US as a whole, that the most recent decade has seen also a relatively high number of heat waves. And this is the case for most regions, and in the West, the most recent years have seen the highest number of heat waves. We also look at the same thing for cold waves. In this case, the number of cold waves are decreasing in the most recent years, and you can see that we've seen the lowest number of cold waves in almost every region in the 2000s decade. So then I'll move on to precipitation. This one is again for the contiguous United States, showing seasonal trends in precipitation. Here we don't see significant increases for all seasons, but there are slight increases in precipitation over the 20th century. We do see a statistically significant increase for the fall season and also for annual. Again, we have the map of precipitation changes for the United States for the last 20 years relative to the reference period. And you can see that most of the United States have seen increases in precipitation. Some areas have seen decreases, such as the southwest United States. And these increases in precipitation are statistically significant for the Midwest and Northeast. And you can see that also from the decadal bar graphs that these regions have seen the greatest increases in precipitation in recent years. Hawaii has seen a significant decrease. The extreme metric here we're looking at for precipitation is extreme heavy events. If you look at the US average, you can see there's been a steady increase in extreme precipitation events over the last few years. Again, we see statistically significant increases this time in the eastern US, this time for the Midwest and Southeast, not so much for the West. So now I'll move on to the regional outlooks. As John described, the scenarios we use are the IPCC SRES A2 and B1 scenarios. The A2 is the high emission scenario indicated by the red line. The B1 is the low emission scenario indicated by the blue line. And we look at general circulation model output mainly from CMIP3, and we also use statistically and dynamically downscale climate model data sets. So we have CMIP3 data that's at 2 to 3 degrees resolution, and we have that for the time period 1900 to 2100. We also have CMIP3 statistically downscale data, courtesy of Catherine Hayhoe. That's at 1/8 degree resolution for this time period. And then we also have the dynamically downscale data from NARCAP, that's the North American Regional Climate Change Assessment Program. That's at a 50-kilometer resolution. And we have that for a reference period and for the future time period of 2041 to 2070, and that one is for the A2 scenario only. So here are some example figures from the second half of these documents from the scenarios. And this is model simulated temperature changes averaged over the southwest United States. Each of these figures we have produced for each of the regions for each of the documents. And this shows the simulated temperature change by decade. The multi-model mean value is indicated by the black dot, and you can see that temperatures are increasing over time. The red X's indicate that the model changes are statistically significant, and you can see that by the end of the century, all models show a statistically significant increase in temperature, and it's well outside this range of the present day year-to-year variability. This one shows the 3 time periods that we look at in the scenarios documents. One is for about 25 years from now. The middle one we can use to compare CMIP3 to the NARCAP data. And then the future one is the end of century. And we can see here that the A2 shows a greater amount of warming than the B1. And we can also see the spread of the models increases over time. But by the end of century, changes in temperature are considerably more than they are presently. And also we can see from this graph that the values for NARCAP are comparable to the values for CMIP3. Here we compare observations to the CMIP3 model values. We have the southwest United States on the left and the southeast United States on the right. The southwest shows a similar pattern to most of the other regions, where we have the observed temperature in blue, annual observed values. The CMIP3 multi-model mean smoothed value is the black line. And you can see that the model does a relatively good job of following the observations. These are the 5th and 95th percentile lines, and the observations are sometimes outside that range, but generally they follow well. The southeast United States, however, we see the effect of what we call the warming hole that I mentioned earlier, where the model misses this lack of 20th century warming. However, the rate of change in recent years is very similar. Here's another example of one of our extremes metrics. This time we're looking at the number of hot days, so that's the number of days where the daily maximum temperature is greater than 95 Fahrenheit or 35 degrees C. This is from the NARCAP dynamically downscaled for the A2 scenario for this mid-or time period. And we can see that throughout the US we're simulated to see an increase in the number of hot days per year. The greatest amount is in the southwest, where it is already warm. And the hatching indicates that the majority of models agree that there will be a statistically significant increase in the number of hot days. This is the same kind of map for the number of cold nights. So this is the number of days where the daily minimum is less than freezing. And again, we can see this time a decrease in the number of cold days throughout the United States. The greatest change is seen in the West. And again, the hatching everywhere indicates that all the models, that most of the models are statistically significant and show increases. Simulated precipitation changes. This is similar to the graph you saw for temperature, where we look at the value for CMIP3 multi-model mean by decade. This again is for the southwest region, just as an example. And this time we can see that although we do see a general decrease in the multi-model mean values, the spread of the models is very large throughout the 21st century. And we can see that not many models, even by the end of the century, are showing statistically significant changes, and many lie within the present-day variability. If we look at a spatial distribution of precipitation, however, we do see model agreement in the northeast of the United States and in the southwest of the United States for certain seasons. This is winter and spring. In the summer and fall, however, you don't see as much of a model agreement as you do in these two seasons, and also annually you see agreement in the northeast and in the southwest. If we look at the same thing for CMIP5, we see a very similar pattern. This is the RCP 8.5, which is slightly higher emissions than the A2 scenario. But again, we see some model agreement in certain areas for certain seasons. And this is a final example of one of our extremes metrics. This is the number of days with precipitation totals greater than 1 inch. We see increases in the number of days for a lot of the US, particularly in the west. We do see some areas of decreases in the south and southwest. But this time there's not much hatching here because we don't see model agreement like we did for temperature, although we do see the majority of models agreeing in certain areas such as the Midwest and Northeast. So in summary, there's been statistically significant warming across the 20th century for the United States, with the exception of the southeast warming hole. In recent years, the number of extreme hot spells has tended to increase and the number of extreme cold spells tended to decrease. There's been statistically significant upward trends in annual and fall precipitation only, and an upward trend in extreme precipitation events is seen for the eastern United States. The GCMs indicate that temperature increases across the contiguous United States are statistically significant out to 2100, but the multi-model mean precipitation is simulated to increase in the north and decrease in the southwest, although the intermodal range of changes is large, as you saw from those graphs. So these documents are on track to be published in January. And thank you very much.
I think we have time for some questions.
How many GCM did you use from the CMIT 5 archive?
It's 15. 15 CMIT 3. Sorry?
How did you pick them?
That's what was available in the data set that we were given. So there's 15 models for A2 and 14 models for B1.
I meant in CMIT 5.
Oh, it's CMIT 5? I didn't do the CMIT 5 analysis. My co-author did that one. So I can give you his contact information.
I guess that's it.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, our next speaker is Sarah Pryor, who will be talking about the climate risks for the Midwest region of the United States.
Okay, great. Yes, as this slide implies, given that the NCA has gone dark, I'm going to spend 12 minutes telling you about thrilling things that appear in 2 books that I've edited that are available from Indiana University Press and a forthcoming paper for the Climate Research Journal. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to extend the Midwest a little bit towards the west to include parts of the Great Plains, just because it draws out some interesting contrasts. This map shows the study domain that I'm going to colloquially refer to as the Midwest, having been born and bred there, of course. It has the beautiful symmetry that it comprises 22% of the US land, population, and GDP. If we look at data from this region, we've seen that the warming over the last 32 years is approximately 4-fold that calculated over the last century. I'm going to talk about projections from the NARCAP model suite. And so these 2 frames are just to persuade you that NARCAP is entirely consistent with the CMIP3 GCMs in terms of the change in the annual mean temperature for this region. So to jump right in, I'm going to talk about our region in terms of 4 key sectors: agriculture, human health, infrastructure and transportation, and then energy. And I'm going to present some key metrics in terms of the temperature regime, precipitation and climate hazards. A selection of those metrics is based on just a sort of bird's eye view of our region in terms of some of our historical vulnerabilities. That's either just incredibly fuzzy or I'm going blind.
It is a bit fuzzy.
It is a bit fuzzy. Well, that's good news, isn't it? I'm too young to be going blind. The upper left-hand picture reminds you that, of course, the Midwest is terribly important in terms of food supply. We are the source of over 80% of national soybean production and more than 80% of corn. If we look at yields of those 2 crops over the last century, we see a 3- to 5-fold increase. But if we look at anomalies from the long-term trend, we see they are negatively associated with the mean summertime maximum temperature and positively associated with indices of moisture availability during the summertime. All of you will be sick to death of hearing about heat waves in the Midwest. So in the upper right-hand panel, I've shown another human health threat that characterizes our region. As you know, most of our urban areas use a combined system for stormwater and sewage. And what that means is under very high flow, we do discharge partially or untreated sewage into our major waterways. So this figure here shows in millions of gallons of semi-treated or untreated sewage flow from just a few of our major urban areas. If we look at metrics, climate metrics from Chicago, just on this inset panel here, what we see is over the 20th century, we saw about a fourfold increase in the probability of receiving 6 centimetres of rainfall in a day, which is often seen as an approximate trigger for CSO. Lower left reminds you that, of course, as a proud Indiana person, I will tell you the Midwest is indeed the crossroads of America. And so what that means is we have an awful lot of freight that traverses our region, and delays in freight, delays in our major aviation hubs, and equally traffic accidents are very strongly related to what's referred to as adverse weather, which usually for our region means heavy rain, icing, or high winds. Lower right-hand panel here, just to give you a sense of our energy sector. As you know, we still show a very strong reliance upon fossil fuel and nuclear for our electricity generation. Every state in the Midwest, incidentally, is a net exporter of electricity, with the exception of Illinois. What this map shows is for each county where the dot is plotted at the center of the county, what's the fraction of withdrawals, water withdrawals, relative to precipitation receipts. So if this value is more than 100, it's telling you that more water is being allocated than is received in that county. What we can see is in the west of the region, high withdrawals are typically associated with irrigation. As we move east, the pink dots here represent the location of major power facilities. And another vignette for you from the Midwest, we use once through cooling and typically have located our power stations on rivers. What that means is that water is extracted from the river, used once for cooling and discharged. So it's an inefficient use of water relative to cooling towers, but also it means, of course, we are somewhat vulnerable to curtailment of our facilities due to excess temperature of our discharged water. And indeed, that was realized, of course, in Illinois for 2 of our major nuclear facilities this year. So based on those historical vulnerabilities, we decided to focus on some integrative metrics, so seasonal total precipitation, but also a few that reflected perhaps more extreme conditions, the wettest pentad, the top wettest days, and also to incorporate climate hazards. And I'm going to make a really strong, impassioned plea here that we start looking beyond temperature and precipitation as we think about vulnerability. So in this diagram, we have 5 panels that represent 5 different metrics: growing season length, mean summertime maximum temperature, number of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, mean apparent temperature. So this is a human health metric that describes the heat stress associated with both temperature and humidity, and then number of cooling degree days, which is a metric, of course, of electricity demand. In each panel, the dots represent historical tendencies. If they're brown, that metric shows an increase over the last 50 years. If it's green, it shows a decrease. And if it's yellow, there's no change at the 95% confidence level. The underlying image shows the ratio of that metric in the future based on the 8 NARCAP ensemble mean to the historical period. So if it's above 1, we're saying higher metric values in the ensemble mean. And the edge color here tells you how many of the 8 RCM simulations agreed on the sign of change. So for each panel, I've also tried to give you a sort of bird's eye synthesis. The top line says, was the historical trend upward, downward, or no change? Then the second line says, for the historical period, if we average over this entire domain, is the ensemble mean from the RCMs biased positively, negatively, or not at all? And then the ensemble mean ratio of that metric in the future, which is 2041 to 2062, relative to the past, which is 1979 to 2000. So for growing season length, there's been a historical tendency towards increased growing seasons, of course, and the RCM suite suggests that that will continue in the future, but there is the buyer beware that the NARCAP regional climate models are strongly positively biased in the growing season. So, of course, this middle row is designed to try and give you a sense of, is the change bigger than the historical bias? Because that might be one index of how confident we should be. If we think about the summertime maximum temperature, no historical tendency when averaged over the domain. The models are a little bit cold biased, but the change in the future relative to the past exceeds that historical bias. For days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, we see a negative trend being driven by the west of our region that might perhaps be linked to increased irrigation use, just as a postulate. There's a bit of a positive bias in the regional climate models, but there is an enormously strong climate change signal. The mean apparent temperature, again, a metric of human health, heat stress, no historical tendency, a bit of a cold bias or a low bias in the RCMs, but again, the climate signal seems to greatly exceed that bias. Cooling degree days, no trend, no bias at all, so Linda ought to be absolutely thrilled by this, and again, a strong tendency towards increased values for electricity. And I will tell you that within the Midwest, our peak demand now is something quite close to 90% of generation capacity. For the precipitation metrics, spring and summer, the historical trend is, of course, a wetting of our spring. The regional climate models are a bit dry biased, both in spring and summer. They suggest an amplification of the historical tendency as we move forward, so continued wetting of our spring, and something of a drying of the summer. And I would emphasize to you that, again, if we look at the color, the edge color here, there's a tremendous consistency in terms of the sign of change from the NARCAP models. Thinking about extreme events, the top 10 wettest days of the year, so the total accumulated on the top 10 wettest days of the year, that again, just to give you a sense, is probably 40 to 60% of our annual total rainfall. This has shown an increase in the historical period, as has the wettest pentad. The RCMs are positively biased in terms of this metric in the past, whereas they're slightly dry biased when it comes to the wettest pentad, the wettest 5-day running period. But both metrics show a tendency towards increased values by the middle of the 21st century, which reminds me to say that, of course, we're focused on the middle of the 21st century because presumably it's sufficiently close at hand that we should be thinking about planning for it. For the dry day duration, and I know this is a crude metric of droughts, but it is nevertheless one that's been used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's shown a decline over the course of the 20th century, I think largely due to reporting bias. Our ability to capture drizzle has improved. The models are negatively biased, but to give you a sense, in the Midwest, our dry duration is 5 days, and the models are suggesting 4 days. So 25% may seem enormous, but it's actually not. Well, or it might be for you. For me, it's not. But I'm 5'2". Moving speedily on, slight tendency towards increased dry day. The climate hazards that I'm going to try and encourage you are just so important. It's hard to evaluate them in a historical context because we don't measure the 20-year return period wind speed or icing. But I think that we really do need to be starting to think about these as major threats, at least within the Midwest region. Slight tendency, according to the NARCAP models, towards increased magnitude of the 20-year return period wind speed and a decrease in icing probability, but this is so sensitive to the way we treat the Great Lakes. So to conclude, the Midwest is already experiencing high impact, high magnitude, high consequence events. Most of the risks that we might associate with those types of events will likely increase. I think we are in a position where we're starting to make actionable climate projections if we define actionable as robust. It's certainly true that the NARCAP RCM suite are not uniformly skillful, but they are pretty skillful for temperature metrics and exhibit some skill for precipitation. I'm absolutely convinced that icing and extreme wind events are our biggest threat that we currently do not quantify. And I want to leave you with a cheery note. The Midwest are acting. We're not being passive. We're undertaking adaptation measures, increasing sewer capacity to try and prevent CSO. And although we have historically been the, quote, dirty men of the US, emitting 20% more greenhouse gases per dollar GDP, we are blossoming in terms of our renewable portfolio. And just this last month, we surpassed 10 gigawatts of electricity supplied to the net from wind energy.
Do we have some questions for Sarah? Yeah.
Just one clarification question. By icing, do you mean freezing rain events?
The gentleman's asking, by icing, do I mean freezing rain events? No, it's a metric based on humidity and temperature, so it should also capture, the model doesn't have to be raining for us to define icing. We just have to have more than 95% relative humidity and temperatures below zero. But, yeah, should clarify that.
Sarah, we have time for one more? Nope, okay. Thanks, Sarah. Okay, the next talk is by Greg Garfin, and it'll be talking about climate change in the southwest of the United States and our southwest region.
Thanks, Fred. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and a privilege to lead the effort on a climate assessment report for the Southwest. And I want to acknowledge the 121 authors, 82 reviewers, and 10 or so paid and unpaid staff members who contributed to the report. I'm going to talk about a technical input report to the National Climate Assessment and not the climate assessment report itself. And this is it's a snapshot of research that was looked at between the fall of 2011 and the spring of 2012, primarily from published peer-reviewed information, and I would say that it's relatively conservative in its conclusions. The region, as has been mentioned before, consists of the 6 states going from the California coast across the 4 North American or U.S. desert regions across to Colorado and New Mexico, including the highest peaks in the conterminous U.S. and lowest valleys. The intellectual leadership for this effort was the Southwest Climate Alliance, which consists of the new Department of Interior Southwest Climate Science Center and 3 of the NOAA RISAs, and of course the 121 authors, 82 reviewers that they were able to pull together. An executive summary of this report is available for download now at the Southwest Climate Science Center website. And in a couple of months, the full report will be published by Island Press through the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange website, and you can also print that as a book on demand. So underlying any of our discussion about climate change, especially vulnerabilities, sensitivities, adaptive capacity, is human influence, including population change. And this is a major thread that underlies every part of the assessment. There's been major land use change and population and economic changes in the region. Drought. So this is a stream flow reconstruction for the Colorado River at Lee's Ferry based on some work by Dave Miko and colleagues. And we find that there have been longer and more severe droughts in the past. And we don't see a trend towards greater drought area, as was mentioned by some folks earlier. But there is a concern about future droughts being hotter. One of the things that we found from looking at the paleo record is that the most recent 50 years is the hottest period of any 50-year period in the last 600. So there's a lot of concern about this combination of hot and dry. In terms of trends in observed temperature, we see maximum, minimum, and average temperatures increasing throughout much of the region. We don't see any concomitant trend in precipitation or we don't see a significant trend in heavy precipitation. There are fewer cold waves. This combination of increased temperature and no substantial trend in precipitation has altered snow hydrology. There's definitely been a trend toward, well-documented trend towards earlier snowmelt runoff. There's more evidence and more agreement on this, and this is well substantiated in detection and attribution studies. And furthermore, in the most recent decade, we've done some update of the work by Iris Stewart and her colleagues, and see that for the upper Colorado River and the upper Rio Grande River basin, an increase in that trend. And one of the newer assessment messages here is about dust on snow, which has increased a lot since Anglo settlement of the West and is considered to contribute perhaps an additional 5% in that decrease in snowmelt runoff, which in terms of Colorado River flow is enough to populate another couple of Las Vegases. For projections, this is a A2 projection from the 16 CMIP3 models using the Maurer et al. Data set. Temperatures projected to increase. There's high confidence in this result. With precipitation, as was mentioned before, there's really quite a bit of spread in the projections. The NARCAP results are also shown here. Perhaps the most robust result is a decrease in spring precipitation, but I wouldn't bet the house on any of the other seasons. Oh, I should also mention, as was shown earlier, that there's some tendency for the northern part of the region to show some increase in precipitation, the southern part of the region to show some decrease. Again, with the snow-related hydrologic variables, especially in the springtime, the projections are for less snow, less runoff, and over most of the region. And in the three major basins, the Sacramento, San Joaquin, the Rio Grande, and the Colorado, over the course of the 21st century, decreases in runoff on the order of around 15%. And of course, that results in situations like the one that we've seen over the course of the last decade, and perhaps worse. Brad Udall, who wrote the chapter on water impacts, makes some particularly good points, that water is sort of a super sector because it has direct and indirect contributions to perhaps all human and natural systems. And he points out that to achieve practical solutions, we need to factor in climate along with legal and institutional stresses and barriers. He also points out that there's a mismatch between the temporal and spatial scales at which climate models produce useful outputs. And as has been noted in any number of documents, there are different magnitudes of increase or decrease in temperature and precipitation, respectively, across models and across downscaling methods, a lack of realistic topography, a lack of realistic monsoon simulation, and also of ENSO. So with this relatively high uncertainty in the projections, water managers are seeking other methods for decision support aside from, at the moment, aside from directly using climate change projections. And these include scenario planning, robust decision-making, portfolio planning, and other methods. And the good news is that people are taking this very seriously, and there's been a lot of increase in federal coordination, agency, private sector, state and municipal initiatives, but most of this has been in planning and on paper and in terms of more science, not so much in terms of action. In terms of the effects of things like the increase in temperature and no major change in precipitation, again, we have more evidence and more agreement about impacts like tree mortality across the region related to both soil moisture stress, increased temperature, and changes in the life cycle of pests and pathogens, and these are associated directly with higher temperatures and decreases in precipitation, and they've been higher than any time in the 90-year instrumental record. Also, increases in fire that are where the flames, as it were, are further fanned by invasive non-native grasses. Again, there are connections to temperature and exacerbated during drought episodes. Projections for fire include 100 to 400% increases in the probability of large fire and 100 to 600% increases in projections for area burned. Moving along over to the coasts, there's a fair amount in our assessment report on ecological changes related to shrinking of habitat due to increased warming in ocean temperatures and also increased ocean acidification. But I really want to spend more time talking about impacts to the built environment, which is most definitely exposed to climate change, sea level rise, and so on. One of the points that the authors of our chapter on the coasts and coastal issues make is that it's not simply the amount of sea level rise that's a threat, but it's also these episodes mostly associated with El Nino events where there are powerful storm surges. And we can't overlook, in fact, we have to look at the combination of these effects when looking at projections of future impacts. And these are the kinds of impacts that could inundate the very airports that you flew into, and also have impacts on coastal roadways and infrastructure such as wastewater and stormwater facilities, and in some cases, power plants. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach take in 40 to 50% of the container shipments from across the ocean. They're certainly at risk to these kinds of impacts. Urban areas in the Southwest are at risk to a number of things. In particular, climate change related health-related illnesses and deaths, which are due to extreme heat, and a combination with the urban heat island effect, and these are projected to increase. I'll note that urban areas in the Southwest use up 2% of the land and populate 92% of the population. Believe it or not, it's the most highly urbanized area of the country, with 10 of the 15 most densest urban areas in the U.S. In the Southwest. One of the things that our authors mention is that adaptive capacity in our urban areas is challenged by fragmentations among many municipalities and a need for increased coordination. We focused a lot on health impacts, and aside from the extreme heat, there's also a projected increase in particulate matter, in particular from wildfires. For many other potential impacts, the situation is too complicated for us to adequately project future health impacts given current knowledge and relatively short health data sets. These sorts of situations are exacerbated along the U.S.-Mexico border, which we cover in our report. This is an area of high poverty, high population growth, water insecurity, substandard housing, and basically higher sensitivity and lower adaptive capacity to climate change. We often talk about the exposure factors, and here really the main message is with regard to adaptive capacity. So this region is exposed to the same kinds of temperature increases, but in addition to that, there's been severe overpumping of groundwater aquifers, and wetlands in places like the Colorado River Delta or further down on the Rio Grande are particularly exposed to increased temperatures. Similar situation for our substantial tribal areas. The Southwest is the home to over 180 tribes. There have been impacts that have been reported, such as drying up of seep springs and ponds, impacts to agricultural methods and agriculture that's been going on for centuries. And again, the major message here is that due to lack of data and specific studies and relative poverty, there's less adaptive capacity. Let me just quickly mention about adaptation and mitigation. There's been a lot of action in the Southwest in this regard, but it'll be very difficult for us to reach a 50 to 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. There's also been very little research on the effectiveness of any of the measures that have been taken thus far. My colleagues who wrote this chapter did an interesting piece of work looking at where adaptation and mitigation either support one another or undermine one another. In the case of something like forest fuel management, it reduces fire risk and it also reduces release of carbon, whereas desalination of water is a great adaptation strategy, but it undermines mitigation because it's highly energy intensive. This is an important area for further research, and we have two chapters that summarize research gaps and uncertainties and with respect to the state of knowledge and some research strategies for the future. So again, at the Southwest Climate Science Center website, you can get a copy of the executive summary. The report will be published in a couple of months by Island Press. Thank you.
We have a bit of extra time since we're running right on schedule, a little bit ahead, so we have some questions. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so the question is about, can I say something about California vis-a-vis the larger Southwest? Okay, in terms of the projected changes or in terms of the actions being taken or? In terms of projected changes. Well, one of the things that I think is important to mention about California is that in terms of some of those hydrologic changes, the early snowmelt runoff and early snowmelt runoff in particular. California is more sensitive than much of the rest of the region, in part because of a difference in the reservoir storage. So, you know, the water managers have to sort of walk a finer tightrope if more of that release is going to be in the winter time than in the normal springtime. Yes. Yeah, it might be on the left side. I believe there's something that mentions the Southwest Climate Summit, which was an event that was held in June, and that should lead to a link. Oh, you might be getting. I'm sorry. So you might be getting the federal website. So the website you want to look at is you can get there two ways. One is southwestclimatealliance.org or www.swcsc.arizona.edu.
Any other questions? No, then I think we're okay. All right, the next one, we're going to segue to a new chapter in the climate assessment, which is the ocean and marine resources. And so we've split up from the past assessments the coastal chapter, which covered ocean and coastal issues, and we now have a separate coastal development chapter, and then the oceans and marine resources. And that talk will be given by Scott Doney along with Andy Rosenberg.
Thanks, Fred. So I've put up here the list of the co-authors for the chapter, as well as the support staff, and would like to thank all the co-authors that have contributed to this. As with the previous talks, I'm going to be focusing not on the chapter itself, but rather on the process and some of the technical input documents that we've used. Can we get it full? Did you guys? Okay. Oops. Okay. Okay. Can you back it up? It's going forward by itself. So for the technical inputs, we had a wide range of technical inputs. I'm going to focus primarily on a technical input that was requested by the advisory committee and was organized by NOAA, had several hundred authors that have contributed to the technical report. And the lead authors were Roger Griffiths and Jennifer Howard. As Fred mentioned, this was the first national assessment with a separate chapter on oceans. And as part of the process, we looked at the technical inputs, reviewed also the scientific literature, and tried to frame a chapter without building from the past, but adding new elements for things that we had seen in the literature and the technical inputs for new climate components that have affected the ocean environment. In terms of the scope of the chapter, we tried to focus primarily on the U.S. exclusive economic zone, which is shown here in the white shaded regions, which touches on the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, Pacific coasts, as well as the Alaska coast, which goes from the Gulf of Alaska through the Bering Sea into the Arctic itself, as well as the areas around Hawaii and Pacific territories. So this chapter spans a wide variety of ecosystems, and it also touches on many of the other regional chapters. In addition to the coastal chapter that Fred mentioned, just about all the other regional chapters had an ocean or marine component. And we spent quite a bit of time trying to make sure that we were consistent and sharing information between the ocean chapter and the regional chapters so that we're looking at the same information and talking about the same broad story. I'll mention this input chapter, again, not talking about the key findings from the chapter itself, but for the input document, the major chapters dealt with changes in the marine physical environment, the impacts of those that have been observed or projected for marine organisms, the impacts then on human uses of the ocean, some of the international implications of climate change, as well as discussions of adaptations and mitigation strategies. So focusing in particular, to start with, on changes in the physical environment, some of the things in the input document as well as in the scientific literature focus on warming of the ocean, changes in sea ice, in particular retreat of the summer sea ice in the Arctic that John Walsh already mentioned, ocean acidification, which is an emerging topic related to the invasion of carbon dioxide into the ocean that changes seawater chemistry, and then also changes in weather and extreme events that are related to the heat content and sea surface temperature of the ocean that drive evaporation and also fuel many of the weather events that we see that then propagate onto land. So just some results from the literature on ocean warming. The upper panel is showing estimates of the ocean heat content going back for about the last 50 years, where you see an increase in ocean heat content over the last several decades. Approximately about 80% of the excess heat in the entire ocean atmosphere cryosphere system is actually in the upper kilometer or so of the ocean. And this upper ocean heat content change affects stratification and circulation patterns in the ocean, has widespread implications for both ocean circulation and marine ecosystems. In the bottom panel is just an estimate from the last IPCC of changes over the last century and a half of sea surface temperature, where you see an uptick in sea surface temperatures over the last couple of decades. This is similar to the plot that you already saw from John Walsh, but just to emphasize the large changes that we've seen recently in summer sea ice. It's a reduction in the extent of ice in the Arctic, but also a real reduction in multi-year ice. So most of the ice that is there is now seasonal first-year ice, and the really thick multi-year ice has reduced dramatically as well. And this is the time series over the satellite period in Arctic sea ice cover. In terms of some of the technical inputs on marine ecosystems, some of the major elements that were included are shifts in ecosystems that are already occurring and have been observed, so things like changes in biogeographic ranges for certain species. The fact that under climate change in a particular location there will be species that do better and species that do worse. We will see changes in the composition of communities, and that whole communities are not going to shift in time. What you're going to see is breaking apart of the existing marine communities as different organisms respond to climate change in different ways depending upon their tolerances and their life history. How climate change exacerbates and interacts with many non-climate stressors. This is particularly true in the coastal ocean. And that there's trying to predict for the future the response of any one particular organism or fishery, for example, is quite difficult. Our reading of the literature shows examples of papers that show both large positive and negative changes in the same fishery for the same region, and is related to the uncertainties into how organisms are going to respond to long-term climate change based on our current scientific understanding. An example of some of the things that you might see in the literature and would show up in the technical report as well. On the left-hand panel is an analysis for the Mid-Atlantic Bight and the Gulf of Maine of commercial species of fish that are tracked by annual fish surveys going back several decades. We can look at trends in the geographic range of different fish species. For the Mid-Atlantic Bight in the left-hand side in the dark black, you see that on average, many of the species are showing a poleward shift, so a northward shift over the last several decades associated with warming. In the Gulf of Maine, you don't see a statistically significant northward shift, but in the Gulf of Maine, you do see that the fish species tend to be moving deeper into the water column, so offshore into deeper waters. In both cases, this is a response of trying to maintain a constant thermal niche. So if you were to plot this in temperature space, things would be relatively constant. So they're moving poleward and deeper to stay in their same thermal niche. This is now a projection from John Hare for Atlantic croaker, one particular fish species, both of the geographic range and the amplitude or magnitude or abundance. And what you see is again, a expansion on the poleward side of the geographic range, but in this case also an increase in the abundance. This species is suggested from model simulations will actually do better under warmer temperatures. That's not true in general. Some species will do better, some species will do worse. This is a graph that came out of a review paper recently looking at the non-climate stressors on the marine environment. Everything here is normalized to 1980. All the solid curves are normalized to this point, and you see 50 to 100% changes in some of these factors, things like wild harvest fish catch, aquaculture. The ones with the dots are also normalized to 1980, but the reference value of 1 is down here. For some things like loss of seagrasses and coastal habitat destruction, you see in some cases factors of 2 to 3 to even factors of 10 increase in these stressors over the last couple decades. So climate change is going to occur in conjunction with a large range of other stressors, and it's understanding that interactions that's important for understanding the impacts on ecosystems. The fourth chapter from the technical input document we received looked at the impacts on human uses, and one of the major findings out of the technical input document was that we're already seeing impacts from climate change on fisheries, energy, transportation, security, human health, tourism and recreation, and maritime governance. I just want to show how distributed the maritime industry is in terms of fishing and aquaculture along our coastal communities. So this is each one of these regions will be experiencing climate change in a different way. There is no single paradigm for understanding how climate change will affect mariculture or fisheries, similarly with the other economic sectors. As a specific example of trends we're already seeing or impacts we're already seeing, the oranges and red in this diagram show regions along the U.S. West Coast where high acidic waters have been advected or upwelled onto the shelf recently. With this increase in upwelling of acidic water, we've seen collapses in the oyster hatchery and oyster shellfish industry along the Pacific Northwest. This has led recently to the state of Washington forming a blue ribbon commission to try to look at adaptation and mitigation strategies directly tied to ocean acidification, which is, if you like, the other side of the carbon dioxide story. And I just want to wrap up with a couple of summary slides. This is a slide looking at how climate change impacts here in black will interact with a variety of other stressors. So things like increases in the extent of low oxygen waters, both in the open ocean and along the coast, inputs of excess nutrients into coastal waters that can drive nutrient eutrophication, and other factors like organic pollutants, trace metals, and habitat destruction. Some colleagues and I a couple of years ago tried to put together a summary slide for the California current system offshore of here of what we saw in the literature for climate change impacts. I apologize with the projection. It's a little difficult to read the individual slides, but what we want to emphasize is that we're seeing changes in the physical environment, changes in the thermocline and thermal structure, changes in the chemistry of seawater, but that the individual organisms' responses are quite different. We're seeing invasions of some species into this region. We're seeing organisms are actually doing better, even though we would expect them to do worse based on laboratory experiments. And we're really at a stage where making predictions at the level of individual organisms is quite challenging. So I'll wrap up there and take questions.
Some questions for Scott?
Wow, that is tough.
Yeah, Linda?
I'm really glad to see this chapter. I don't mean to comment negative, but why do you think it took so long for ocean ecosystems to become more seriously considered in
So just to repeat the question, it was a question about why did it take so long before oceans appeared as an independent chapter, as a separate chapter? This is the first time I've been brought into the assessment, so I can't really comment about the history. I do know from my senses that there's been a considerable science focus over the last several years on ecosystem effects of rising temperature and ocean acidification. So in some sense, there's a growing body of work to base a assessment. Any other questions?
Probably got the answer to the question in the last slide, but regarding the migration of fish species that you mentioned earlier, and how those species were sort of migrating to find a temperature niche. Is there an important caveat there that presumably the species that they feed upon also have to move with that temperature niche? Is that considered a big player in a lot of this?
In the literature, well, terrestrial and marine, you see the mismatch hypothesis, either that the seasonal timing of predator and prey biomass becomes decoupled by climate change, or you get mismatch because they're shifting geographically at different rates. And that can have really dramatic effects, particularly if a predator has a life history where they depend upon substantial prey at a particular time of year during their breeding season or during their juvenile stage. And if, say, the phytoplankton are blooming at a different time of year, that can have dramatic effects.
Is there any evidence of that now? Or is it more of a
for some systems, I think there's some evidence for that. But, okay, thanks.
I want to mention, I guess Greg had indicated that their report is going to be published in Island Press. I want to point out that the regional reports that form the foundational material that Scott mentioned and Greg mentioned and Sarah mentioned, those will all be coming out via Island Press over the next several months. And in that format, they'll be freely available for download if you would like to get copies of them. So that's a place at cakex.org to look for all of the regional reports over the next 6 months or so. The last talk of the session is on NASA's contribution to the National Climate Assessment, and that will be given by Allison Leidner.
Thank you and good afternoon. It's really exciting to be here to tell you today about how NASA has been involved in the National Climate Assessment, both for the production of the 2013 report, but also for the sustained assessment process that you heard described earlier. This is the perspective of a federal agency, so it's a little bit different than the talks you've heard about already. And I'd like to start off by acknowledging my co-authors and collaborators, most of whom are in the NASA Earth Science Division. Fred Lipschultz is actually a NASA detailee to the National Climate Assessment. And I've also worked very closely with Lawrence Friedel and Jack Kay, who are the directors of the Applied Sciences Program and the Research and Analysis Program at NASA more broadly. So what I hope that you're probably pretty well aware of is that NASA models and observations have extensively contributed to our understanding of climate change, primarily at global scales, but also increasingly at regional scales. But what you might be less familiar with is that NASA has been a very strong player in the U.S. Global Change Research Program and many of the domestic activities, but also the research activities that have been going on there as well. And we contribute both from the science perspective and the research that we contribute, the applications that help connect our science to user needs, and also actually from a financial perspective, NASA is one of the largest contributors to the U.S. Global Change Research Program budget. And as a result, we've been very active in the National Climate Assessment. So there's a variety of ways in which we've participated in the National Climate Assessment. First and foremost, as a science agency, we're interested in making sure that the science that our researchers have conducted, both at NASA research centers and in the broader investigator community, are connected up with assessment activities to make sure that that's available and known by many people, and also so that more people are aware of NASA remote sensing observations and NASA models and NASA research to enable better climate assessments and to just broaden the access to the entire research community. We also, as a U.S. government agency, have an interest in seeing that the science that we support helps the nation both understand the impacts of climate change and also can inform adaptation activities. And so that's one of the reasons that we want to participate. And then finally, it also helps inform our activities. It helps identify research priorities that help guide future activities within the agency. And so there's been a variety of ways that we as an agency have participated in the National Climate Assessment, and our approach has been a little bit different than some of the other federal agencies because we don't have a specific region or a specific sector that really most closely ties to NASA. In fact, the research that our research centers and that our investigators conduct really form a broad range of assessment activities. And so as a result, we've really been interested in supporting the broad-based foundational science that supports the National Climate Assessment and also supporting individual science to increase the number of scientists that are familiar with conducting climate assessments so that they can do contributions to both the 2013 report but also the longer-term sustained assessment activities. And so that's been a little bit different than some of the other federal agencies, but we've really been able to leverage the strength of our assets with producing the science and really funding this kind of science activities with the benefits of other federal agencies and the broader research community and the climate change community. So we've participated by participating in the Interagency National Climate Assessment Working Group. That's where I come in. I help coordinate NASA's resources and help bring some of the intellectual and financial resources that NASA has to help guide the federal side of the National Climate Assessment. We've also supported various workshops and activities. You heard a little bit earlier the mention of these National Climate Assessment Indicators. NASA in 2011 supported 2 workshops, one related to physical climate indicators and one related to societal climate indicators, to help lay the foundation for what these climate change indicators might be for the future assessment reports. And so these workshop reports are actually available on the National Climate Assessment website. We've also garnered the support of the Scientific Visualization Studio to help produce dynamic visualizations for the 2013 report that might be available in the report or they might be available on the website, but to really help bring life and visualizations and pictures available to highlight some of the key findings and science findings of the climate assessment report in a way that hopefully a picture can sometimes represent 1,000 words. And finally, many NASA scientists, both at our research centers, at headquarters itself, and also in the investigator community, have been involved in writing many of these technical reports and also have actually been authors on many of the climate assessment chapters. But frankly, one of the most interesting and really fun ways that I think that we've been involved is by supporting some research activities that have been involved for the National Climate Assessment. And so we recently had a solicitation that was open to the entire research community to help use NASA remote sensing resources to develop some test indicators that could potentially be incorporated into the National Climate Assessment. This solicitation recently closed, and we anticipate that we're going to fund about 10 to 15 projects over a year to 18-month period, totaling about $2 million. And that review process is currently underway. And we expect these selections to happen in 2013, with the research starting in 2013 and continuing through 2014. Another research activity that's currently underway is a solicitation that was open to our NASA research centers. And what we did here is we funded, starting in 2011, 14 projects that were supposed to be 3 years each. And the total funding for that was about $7.5 million. And what this research was going to do was to develop enabling tools and assessment products, some for the 2013 report, but really this was our start at supporting the sustained assessment effort by funding projects that could get research out into the literature and be available for use in both the current assessment and also in future assessments. And this has been a little bit of a different activity for NASA to undertake because it's had a little bit more of a tool and product overlay than our typical research activities. And what I'm going to do now is highlight a couple of these research projects to give you a flavor of the kinds of things that we've been supporting. And I have worked with the investigators to talk about some of this research, but I will take responsibility if I manage to miscommunicate their findings slightly, and I apologize in advance. So the first project is a development of a regional climate model and evaluation system. This was developed by Dwayne Walliser and his colleagues at JPL. And the idea behind this is that regional climate models allow for assessment of climate impacts at a scale that's really helpful for decision makers. But these models can be then compared against observations to assess the quality of the models and to help guide model improvement. And so what they've done is develop this tool that can allow for this, a better platform for this model evaluation. And so I know this is a little bit of a complicated diagram, but there's really two parts to this model evaluation system. There's the database that has brought in observations from multiple sources, both satellite-based and ground-based data, into a common format, and then the evaluation tool, which then allows this data to be extracted and regridded in a common format to allow for analysis. And they've built these tools that can allow for various metrics to be calculated and also the results to be visualized. And so just to give you a little bit of a sense of what they've found is that they've looked at, and this is just one example here, where they've looked at ground-based precipitation data and satellite-based surface insolation data and compared using NARCAP hindcasts for these regional climate models to compare against observations. And so the observations are the top two figures, and then the panels represent different model evaluations, with the lower right one being the ensemble mean. And what they found is that for both the precipitation data and the surface insolation data, that there are systematic regional biases, and that these biases are actually negatively correlated. And what they think is that this is associated with the way that clouds are incorporated into these regional climate models. So this kind of evaluation has allowed us to gain some insight into how we might be able to improve some of these models in the future. Another project has been focusing on assessing the impact of extreme heat scenarios on public health. And this project has been led by Dale Quattrochi at the Marshall Space Flight Center. And extreme heat is actually one of the more deadly weather-related hazards. And we expect that this hazard is likely to increase in both the fact that there's going to, under warming situations, but also as we move to more urban environments where we get the urban heat island effect, we're likely to see some of these problems increase. And so what this project has done is provide some historical measures of extreme heat to enable the assessment on public health. And what they've done here is used global climate models to look at changes in heat, in temperature, and also in humidity, which are the two key factors that go into measuring heat indices. But global climate models are at a coarse spatial and temporal resolution that doesn't really provide a lot of information to the public health community. And so what they've done is using a land data assimilation system is to downscale the output from these global climate models to a finer temporal and spatial resolution. So what you see here on the top figure is actually the heat index for 2007, which was actually a particularly warm year. And you can see that there was a fair number of places that were 100 degrees and higher, sort of represented by the yellow colors to the warmer colors. But when we look to sometime mid-century under some of the climate models that they looked at, they were able to look at the changes in temperature and humidity, and look and add that to the analog year of 2007 to develop a map of what it might look like under some climate change scenarios for heat index in the future. And you can see that the center of the country has quite a lot of areas where the heat index is greater than 100 degrees. And so what I think is a really neat aspect of this project is that they've developed it in collaboration with colleagues at the Centers for Disease Control. And what they're doing is they're going to be providing some of these heat index metrics at a county level, which is the scale of analysis that's frequently used by public health researchers. And then they're going to make this available through these CDC databases. So it's sort of an example of a really neat collaboration that was enabled by these climate assessment activities. And finally, Jim Kolatz and his colleagues at the Goddard Space Flight Center have looked at climate change impacts on fire activities. And for the first phase of this project, they've looked at some climate controls on the amount of burned area in the United States. And what they found was that potential evapotranspiration is really strongly correlated with a monthly burned area. And they found, as shown in this figure on the bottom right, that there's been a change in potential evapotranspiration over the past 30 years. And they believe that this is going to be is part of the reason why we've seen more burned area in the United States. And this is actually research that's been recently published. And what they're going to be talking about here at AGU in a poster on Thursday is looking at the projected future fire activity in the United States. And what they found is that drier conditions by the mid-century are expected to increase the projected burned areas under both low and high climate change scenarios. And so you can see these percentage increases in the table that are broken down by national climate assessment region. So it's this kind of way that they've broken down their research that's going to enable them to inform more directly future climate assessment activities. And we can see that there's quite a lot of expected increase in the amount of burned area really all across the country. And what they've also found is that it's not just the amount of burned area, it's also the change in the frequency of the extreme events that lead to fires. And so, I'm sorry, the scale seems to have gotten lost somewhere along the way, but the warmer colors are more extreme events. And so we've seen some in the last decade, but by mid-century we really expect to see far more. And so again, this is really informing kind of what we might see in the future under climate change. So as we transition from the production of the 2013 report to the sustained assessment process, I think that NASA is really well positioned because we've already been funding these research activities and funding investigators to really become more capable of helping with climate assessments. And we're really excited about this opportunity. The research from these center calls are going to be wrapping up sometime next year, but we look forward to the selection of proposals under this indicator solicitation to help enable this effort moving forward. And finally, we are excited to continue our collaboration with our federal partners and also with the broader science community and the broader climate change, global change community to continue our involvement in climate assessment activities. And so with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
No questions? Yeah, there's a question.
Yes? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question. So the question was about international collaborations, and NASA scientists have been quite involved in IPCC activities, and so that's a very ground-up kind of process. I'm not particularly familiar with the details of how our scientists have contributed to IPCC from a programmatic level. The Global Change Research Program, more broadly, does have an international component to it, and so both the climate assessment and, as a result, NASA has been involved in those activities. I don't really know the very specific details about that, though. I apologize.
All right. I think we're set.
Thank you.
All right, that's the end of the session. I want to thank everyone for coming and listening, and I hope you'll all take advantage of the opportunity in January to take part in the 3-month review of the draft report that was talked about today and in the poster sessions this morning over in Moscone South. And the report, as we mentioned, will be coming out in December, in late December or into January this year for the draft, and then late December for the final report next year. Thank you very much.